We're building a large assembly table in this episode of CityBilly Adventures. Stay tuned. My wife and I grew up in the suburbs of Northeast Ohio, and we started our family there too. Then a few years ago, we stumbled into this dilapidated estate property that just had way too much potential to pass up. Follow along as we DIY our way through creating our dream estate, one project at a time. A wise man once said, "You're from the city, but you like hillbilly things. You're a city Billy." So we're back for another episode in our ongoing workshop series, which you can catch up on right here. In the last video, we installed a 2-stage dust collection system. Now we're going to hook it up to the table saw and start building a large outfeed assembly table. Now this video is going to end up being at least a 2-part series. This video is going to focus on building just this basic assembly table so I can stop working on my knees. Then down the road, we'll start customizing it by adding storage and functionality. Now I'm lucky that my shop has room for a full-size 4x8 table. The plan is to build a frame out of construction lumber, add a laminated top, and put the whole thing on locking caster wheels. So to get started, I'm going to take this pile of 2x6s that's been patiently waiting for a purpose and mill it up to build the frame. The frame is going to be slightly smaller than the 4x8 top. I want to leave room for a face frame and drawer fronts and still have the top overhang just like any other counter. I cut the boards to rough length so they were a little easier to work with. Now if you don't have a pile of scrap 16-foot 2x6s laying around, here's a more reasonable cut list. Then I attached my new dust collection system to the table saw and began cutting the boards down to a width of 3¼ inches. These 2x6s were rescued from a dumpster years ago and needed a little freshening up. I cut any imperfections off of one side of each piece. Then I set the fence to 3¼ inches and cut the other side. I also made sure to appreciate that the majority of the dust I was creating was getting sucked into the dust collection hose. It didn't get all of it, but it was light years better than what I'm used to. It'll get even better once I incorporate overhead dust collection near the blade. Once all my boards were the proper length and width, I used glue and screws to laminate 2 boards together to create half-lap joints at both ends. I used a small clamp to straighten out any slight curves in the boards. Then I laid out all the boards to assemble the 2 sides of the frame. I installed 1 screw in each joint to hold it in rough shape. Then I used a speed square to square everything up before driving in the rest of the screws. Then I began attaching the stretcher pieces. I used the Craig Foreman to drill 3 pocket holes in each connection. I attached each stretcher using 2.5-inch pocket hole screws. These giant clamps helped hold everything in place while the frame came together. After school let out, my oldest son helped attach the last few pieces. Once the assembly table is finished, I don't plan on having to move it around very often, but I wanted to have the option. These casters hold 600 pounds each, which is more than I'll ever need. They also act as leveling feet and lock the table in place. So far, so good. For the top, I'm going to laminate 2 sheets of 3/4-inch MDF and top it off with a sheet of Formica. I probably should have locked those casters before I tried to finagle this heavy-ass sheet of plywood on top of it. Oh well, it's there to stay now. This is about the time I noticed that something just didn't look right. So what I eventually figured out is I didn't account for the double-thick frame when I came up with the length of the horizontal stretchers. That extra 1.5 inches on each side meant that my top didn't have enough overhang. Well, shit. That MDF is just as heavy as I remember. But what I still didn't remember was to lock those wheels. I disassembled all the stretchers so I could cut them to the correct length. Yep, this is going great. Just more kindling for the fire. By this point, my back was really wishing I had an extra set of hands to move this MDF. But hey, look who finally thought to lock the wheels. I used the circular saw to cut 1.5 inches off the 4-foot and the 8-foot side. I'm going to add a 3/4-inch piece of maple trim around the perimeter of the top, and this way the total dimensions of the top will remain 4-foot by 8-foot. This would have been a perfect time to use my new overhead dust collection, but it wasn't built yet. By this point, the boys were home from school and could help me laminate the second piece of MDF. First, we spread out a buttload of wood glue. This silicone brush works great for applying glue to small pieces of wood. Turns out it doesn't work well at all for spreading glue over large areas. We ended up using popsicle sticks, and that worked 100 times better. My back was so happy to have help with the MDF this time. I used some heavy objects to hold the 2 sheets together while the glue dried, and I also added some screws.
After the glue had a chance to dry, I used a flush trim bit on my router to cut the top piece of MDF to the same dimensions as the bottom piece. Now, even though my last video was all about dust collection, I built this table before the boom arm was finished. So to avoid all this dust going everywhere in the shop, I wheeled the table outside for this study. The boys helped me attach 1x2 strips of maple around the perimeter of the top. Maple is a hard wood and will be a nice, durable edge for the table. Then it was time to add the Formica top. I applied contact cement to the top layer of MDF and to the bottom of the Formica. The MDF ended up needing 2 coats of cement. Just as the name would suggest, the contact cement forms a permanent bond as soon as the pieces touch each other. I put some scrap strips of wood on top of the MDF while Mrs. CityBilly and I lined up the Formica sheet. The Formica is a little oversized, so we just had to get everything close at this point. Then I worked from the middle and pulled one strip out at a time, smoothing the laminate as I went. Then I brought the flush trim bit back out and cut the Formica flush with the edge of the tabletop. Then I changed to a chamfer bit and cut a 45-degree angle along the top edge of the table. Then I painted the maple trim to match the top. The overspray may look a little sloppy now, but phase 2 of this project includes adding a face frame and drawers underneath the table, so the overspray will eventually all get covered up. The top had to come off one last time so I could drill pocket holes in the frame. I should have done this earlier in the project, but I'm trying to keep my chiropractor in business.
But this type of thing is usually done in strip malls next to a Little Caesars.
After putting the top back on for the final time, I crawled underneath and attached it to the frame with 2.5-inch pocket screws. That was a lot easier said than done.
So this seems like a logical place to end part 1. We've built a large work surface that could be just fine the way it is. A sheet of plywood on the bottom here would add a decent amount of additional storage for the shop. But we're going to go further and add all kinds of features to this table down the road. Coming up in the next episode of our workshop series, I'm building a mobile plywood storage cart.
Oop, no clip. Oop, thought we had a clip. Nope, okay.
We'll see you then.